The morning Martha Bancroft walked into the First Territorial Bank of Calico Flats for the fourth time. The clerk behind the brass-barred window actually flinched. It was the spring of 1882, a year that had already shown its teeth to the Arizona Territory with a drought that cracked the red earth like old porcelain, and a cattle plague that had taken half the livestock along Sutter Creek. The town of Calico Flats sat at the edge of a broad mesa, stubborn as a man who refuses to admit he is lost, its main street lined with false-fronted buildings painted in colors that the sun was doing its level best to bleach into oblivion. Horses stood tied to posts outside the general store. A pair of old-timers played checkers on an upturned barrel near the livery. Somewhere down the way, a dog barked at nothing in particular, because that was what dogs in small towns did. Martha did not notice any of it. She walked with her chin up and her dark brown eyes fixed straight ahead, her black morning dress exchanged at last for a sensible dress of deep navy wool, because it had been 2 years now since Thomas Bancroft died of the fever, and she had decided that the dead did not require her perpetual darkness. She carried a leather satchel against her side, worn at the corners but clean. Inside it were papers, important papers. Papers she had organized, reorganized, annotated, and checked against every number she knew how to check them against. Papers that told the story of a ranch that was still breathing even when everything around it wanted it to stop. The Bancroft homestead was 40 acres of grazing land 3 miles south of town, plus a farmhouse that Thomas had built with his own 2 hands and a stubbornness that bordered on the religious. He had left Martha with the land, 2 horses, a milk cow named Birdie, 14 head of cattle, a root cellar full of preserved goods, a 12-year-old daughter named Clara, and a debt to the Calico Flats Savings and Territorial Bank that sat on her chest every morning like a stone. The debt was not enormous, $240. In another world, in a prosperous year, it might have been manageable. But the drought had taken the winter wheat, and the plague had taken 4 of the cattle, and Clara needed new boots, and the roof over the back bedroom had decided, after years of faithful service, to start letting the sky in. Martha had done every calculation available to a woman who had taught herself arithmetic from the one textbook Thomas kept on the shelf beside his Bible. She had looked at what she had, what she could sell, what she could earn taking in mending and washing from the other women in town, and she had come to the same conclusion every time. She needed a loan, a small one. $80 would see her through until the cattle were fat enough to sell in the fall. $80 against a 40-acre ranch with a standing house and livestock, and a woman who had never in her life failed to pay what she owed. The first time she had walked into this bank, the bank manager, a man named Gerald Howell, who wore his watch chain with the importance of a man who has confused wealth with worth, had listened to her with the particular brand of polite patience that is really just a slower form of no. He had looked at her papers. He had looked at her. And he had told her, in the careful language of a man protecting himself from accusation, that the bank's lending practices required a male cosigner for any loan extended to a woman operating a property alone. Martha had asked with perfect composure whether the bank's lending practices also required the male cosigner to have better mathematics than she did, because she would very much like to see that particular rule in writing. Howell had not appreciated that. The answer had still been no. The second time, she had brought Thomas's brother, Edward, all the way from Tucson, a man who ran a dry goods store and had never done a dishonest thing in his life except borrow money from Martha herself twice and never mention it again. The bank had considered Edward, found him to be a man who did not own property in Calico Flats and whose business was 50 miles away, and had declined on the grounds of insufficient local collateral from the cosigner. Martha had pointed out that she was the one with local collateral. The answer was still no. The third time, she had arrived with a letter from Pastor Elias Greer of the Calico Flats Methodist Church, who had written such a thorough and earnest character endorsement that it ran to 3 pages and included the somewhat surprising detail that Martha Bancroft made the finest apple preserves in the county. Gerald Howell had read the letter. He had thanked her for it. And he had told her that the bank's board of directors had reviewed her application and found that the current economic climate made lending to a single female landowner an untenable risk, regardless of character. Martha had thanked him in the voice she reserved for people who were not worth the heat of her anger, and she had walked out into the bright Arizona sun and stood on the boardwalk for a long moment, breathing slowly, until she was reasonably certain she was not going to do something she would regret. That had been 3 weeks ago. In those 3 weeks, the roof over the back bedroom had gotten worse. A traveling tinker had come through and fixed the iron stove for $2 she could not quite afford to spend. Clara had worn her old boots, her toes pressing against the worn leather, without complaint, because Clara was 12 years old and already knew not to add to her mother's troubles, which was a knowledge no child should have to carry, but which she wore with a quiet grace that made Martha's heart ache every time she noticed it. And then, on a Tuesday morning in late April, Martha had risen before the sun, fed the horses and Bertie, made sure Clara was fed and on her way to the schoolhouse, and told herself with a firmness that had nothing theatrical about it that she was going to walk into that bank one more time. She was going to sit in that chair in front of Gerald Howell's desk, and she was going to lay out her papers, and she was going to ask for $80 against her ranch. And if he told her no again, she was going to figure out something else, because there was always something else, even when you could not see it yet. She had just pushed open the heavy door of the First Territorial Bank of Calico Flats when she heard a voice behind her. "Ma'am, I apologize. I believe you've got my door." She turned. The man standing on the boardwalk behind her was tall enough that the brim of his hat cleared the top of the doorframe with barely an inch to spare. He was perhaps 32 or 33, with the kind of face that the Arizona sun had worked on for years, brown and weathered, with laugh lines at the corners of gray eyes that were currently carrying something between amusement and apology. He wore a blue chambray shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows despite the morning chill, dust on his boots that told of a long ride, and a hat the color of old straw that had clearly seen every kind of weather. He carried no weapon that she could see on first glance, which was either admirable or suspicious, and he was holding the door open for her with one large, work-roughened hand, while his other hand held the reins of a chestnut quarter horse he had tied to the post outside. "Your door," Martha repeated. "Figure of speech," he said and smiled. It was a good smile, uncomplicated. "After you." She went in first, and he came in behind her, and the bank clerk, young Tommy Briggs, who was barely old enough to shave, looked at both of them and directed Martha to the waiting area with a gesture that had a familiar dismissiveness about it, then turned his full attention to the man behind her. "Mr. Finley," Tommy said, brightening. "Mr. Howell is expecting you." The tall man, apparently Patrick Finley, glanced at Martha and then back at Tommy. "Mrs. Bancroft first," he said, pleasantly but in a tone that was not a suggestion. Tommy blinked. "But Mr. Howell has an appointment." "I'll wait," said Patrick Finley, and walked to the row of wooden chairs along the wall and sat down in one with the particular ease of a man who does not spend a great deal of energy worrying about what other people think of his choices. Martha looked at him. He had picked up a copy of the Calico Flats Courier from the small table beside the chairs and was reading it with apparent interest, entirely unbothered by the clerk's confusion or her own stare. She turned back to Tommy Briggs. "I would like to see Mr. Howell, please." Tommy, outmaneuvered, went and knocked on the office door. Gerald Howell came out with the expression of a man who has prepared himself for a particular kind of meeting and been presented with an unexpected detour. He looked at Martha. He looked past her at Patrick Finley, who gave him a small nod over the top of the newspaper. He looked back at Martha. "Mrs. Bancroft," he said, and there was a heaviness in it. "Please come in." She sat across from his wide mahogany desk and arranged her papers with the composed precision of someone who has done this before and intends to do it better this time. Gerald Howell settled into his chair with the weight of a man carrying the burden of his own policies. "Mrs. Bancroft," he began, "I want to be transparent with you. The board's position hasn't. I know what the board's position has been," Martha said. "I am asking you to reconsider it on the basis of the figures in front of you." She laid the papers out one by one. The deed to the property, clear and clean in Thomas's handwriting. A ledger she had kept herself for the past 2 years, every expenditure, every sale, every coin she had earned and spent and saved. A letter from Jacob Prout, the cattle buyer in Tucson who had bought from Thomas for years and who had written, at Martha's request, that he intended to buy from her in the fall and at what price per head. A record of every debt Thomas had ever taken and repaid, going back 8 years. And then she laid down the last paper, which was her own written assessment of the loan request, $80, the proposed repayment schedule of $10 per month beginning in September when the cattle sold, the interest she was willing to pay, and the collateral she was offering, which was the ranch itself. Gerald Howell read through the papers with the careful slowness of a man who is hoping he will find a reason in them, because Martha Bancroft's papers were better organized and more thoroughly documented than most of the loan applications he received from men who wore good suits and spoke in confident voices, and whose collateral was often a great deal less solid than they presented it to be. He took off his glasses and polished them. This was a habit Martha had observed all 3 times before, and she had come to understand it as the gesture of a man stalling while he arranged his refusal. "The board's policy regarding sole female applicants," he started, "has cost your bank money," Martha said, "because I am going to repay this loan and your bank will earn the interest, and instead of doing that here, I am going to have to find another way to do it, which I will. I want to be clear about that, Mr. Howell. I am not here because I am without options. I am here because this is the reasonable and logical option, and I would like us both to behave reasonably and logically." There was a silence. Outside the office, through the thin wall, she could hear the faint rustle of a newspaper. "The policy," Howell said, and his voice had lost some of its certainty, "requires a local male cosignor with demonstrable property in the county." Martha thought of Edward, who had come all the way from Tucson and still not been enough. She thought of Pastor Greer's 3-page letter. She thought of Clara's boots. "Then the answer is no," she said, and she said it with more certainty than she had ever said no in her life, because she had finally, in the space of this fourth sitting across this desk, understood something she had not let herself understand before. Gerald Howell was not going to give her this loan. Gerald Howell was never going to give her this loan, not because her papers were insufficient or her collateral inadequate, but because she was a woman alone, and the bank's policy was a wall, and walls did not move because you asked them politely. What she had been doing for 3 visits was asking the wall to please consider moving. What she needed to do was find a door. "I appreciate your time," she said, gathered her papers, snapped the satchel closed, and stood up. Howell stood too, which was either courtesy or relief, and Martha thought it was probably a bit of both. She walked out of the office and into the main bank hall. Patrick Finley was still in the chair, still reading the newspaper or appearing to, and he looked up when she came out. He read her face with the directness of someone who did not pretend not to see things. "No again," he said. It was not intrusive, it was not smug, it was just a man asking a plain question. "No again," she said. She walked past him toward the door. "Mrs. Bancroft." She stopped, turned. He had folded the newspaper and set it down and was looking at her in a way that was straightforward without being forward. "My name is Patrick Finley. I run the Lazy Cross Ranch up on the North Ridge. Would you sit down for just a moment before you go?" "Why?" "Because I have something to say that might be worth your time, and I would rather say it here where it is cool than on the boardwalk where any person who wants to insert their opinion into someone else's business will feel at liberty to do so." Martha considered him. She was a good judge of people, sharpened by necessity and by the particular clarity that came with managing everything alone for 2 years. This man was not a fool, and he was not trying to impress her, and he was not looking at her the way some men looked at a widow, which was like she was a problem that needed solving with their particular solution. She sat down in the chair one space away from him. "I have heard about your situation," he said. "This is a small town." "That is an understatement," he almost smiled. "I have also heard about your ranch and your cattle and your ledger. Mr. Briggs is not what anyone would call discreet." Martha filed that away for later. "What I want to say," Patrick continued, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees and his hat turned in his hands, "is that I have a proposition that is not charity and is not complicated. I need a reliable supplier of beef for the winter months when my own operation is short. Your cattle are Herefords, which are good eating cattle. I am willing to pay you in advance for a guaranteed delivery of 8 head in November." At Prute's going rate, Martha looked at him. "How much would that be?" He named the figure. It was to within $12, exactly $80. She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the old-timers were still playing checkers. The dog had found something new to bark at. "Why?" she said. He did not pretend not to understand the question. "Because it is a good business arrangement for me. Because Howell's policy is foolish and wastes good people's time. And because," he paused, and there was an honesty in his pause that she noticed, "my mother ran a homestead alone for 6 years after my father died, and no one helped her when they should have, and she lost it, and I have never stopped thinking that someone should have." Martha was quiet again, but it was a different quality of quiet. "I would want a written agreement," she said. "Fair terms for both parties. I would expect nothing less. I am not a charity case, Mr. Finley. I know that. I just told you why it is a good deal for me. It is a somewhat better deal for me." "Yes," he agreed, "it is. But you have a better product than you are getting credit for, and in a drought year a guaranteed supply is worth paying ahead for. The math is reasonable." She looked at him for another moment, and then she looked down at her satchel, and then she looked back at him and said, "Where do you suggest we draw up this agreement?" "Pastor Greer has a good hand and is legally minded. He has witnessed half the contracts in this county." Martha stood, and Patrick Finley stood too, and they walked out of the First Territorial Bank of Calico Flats together into the bright Arizona morning. And she did not need their loan, and she did not look back. They walked to the pastor's office, which was attached to the white church at the end of the main street. Pastor Greer, who was a small man with a large beard and the kind of legal mind that had led him to the ministry, only after a brief and entirely earnest career as a land surveyor, welcomed them with the mild astonishment of a man who has not expected this particular combination of people in his doorway. He drew up the agreement, while Martha and Patrick sat on opposite sides of his small table, and Martha went through every clause with a thoroughness that made the pastor's eyebrows rise in professional appreciation. Patrick proposed nothing she had not already considered. He countered one of her amendments with a reasonable alternative. She accepted it. The whole thing took 40 minutes, and at the end of it there was a clean document that gave Martha Bancroft $80 in advance against the delivery of 8 Hereford cattle to the Lazy Cross Ranch in November, at the agreed price per head, with a penalty clause for either party that was fair and specific. Pastor Greer witnessed it and signed it, and then he looked at both of them over his reading glasses and said, with the air of a man who has observed a great many human arrangements, "Well, that is about the most sensible thing I have seen in this office in a considerable while." Martha took her copy of the agreement and put it carefully in her satchel, beside the papers that the bank would never see again. She thanked Patrick Finley with a handshake that was firm and direct, and he took it with the same quality, and they parted at the end of the church lane, him heading back toward the bank to conduct whatever business he had originally been there for, and her heading toward the general store to buy her daughter a pair of boots that fit. The boots were brown leather, sturdy and well-made, with brass buckles at the ankle. Clara put them on that evening and walked around the kitchen 3 times with a seriousness of purpose that made Martha laugh for the first time in longer than she could calculate. In the weeks that followed, Martha threw herself into the work that the money allowed her to do. She hired a local boy, 16-year-old Sam Decker, to help mend the fencing along the south pasture, paying him in meals and a small wage she could now afford. She had the roof repaired by a carpenter named Oates who worked quickly and charged fairly. She bought a new length of pipe for the irrigation channel that brought water from the creek to the kitchen garden, and she planted the kitchen garden with the focused intensity of a woman who intends to eat well. She heard Patrick Finley's name occasionally in town. He was known as a fair man, a hard worker, someone who paid what he owed and did not involve himself in other people's troubles unless invited. His ranch on the North Ridge, the Lazy Cross, employed 6 hands and ran about 200 head of cattle on a better water supply than most properties in the area. He had come to Calico Flats 3 years ago from Texas, bought the land, built it into something respectable. People spoke of him without drama, which in a small town in 1882 was its own kind of high praise. She did not see him again for nearly 3 weeks. And then one morning she was in the east pasture checking on a cow that had been favoring her left foreleg, crouching beside her with her sleeves rolled up and her hair pinned in a practical knot, when she heard a horse on the track behind the fence and looked up to see Patrick Finley on the chestnut quarter horse, pulling to a stop. "Mrs. Bancroft," he said, leaning on the saddle horn, "that the cow or the leg?" "The leg," Martha said, straightening. "She stepped in a rabbit hole last week. I think it is mending, but I wanted to be sure." He dismounted without asking and tied the horse to the fence post and came through the gate and crouched beside the cow with the ease of a man who has spent the majority of his life in proximity to cattle. He ran his hand along the leg with a practiced gentleness, and the cow, who was not friendly with strangers, did not object. "Tenderness here," he pressed lightly above the fetlock. "She flinched at that spot day before yesterday, less today. Looks like a strain, good rest, keep her off rocky ground." "She should be fine." He stood up, dusted his knees. "Good cattle." "They are," Martha agreed. He looked out over her pasture with a genuine regard that she noticed. Not the appraising look of a man calculating the value of what he was seeing, but the look of someone who respected a thing that was well tended. "I am actually here for a reason," he said, "other than diagnosing your livestock. I assumed. My cook quit. Apparently decided that ranching life did not suit his ambitions, which is a thing you find out when the man has already gone. I am in town to post a notice, and I wondered if you knew of anyone looking for work. Good wage, nothing fancy." "What kind of cook are you looking for?" "The kind that can feed 6 hungry men 3 times a day and not poison any of them. It sounds simple, but you would be surprised." Martha thought. "The widower out at Miller Creek, Mr. Hands. His daughter is 18 and a better cook than anyone in this county. She has been looking for work since the spring." "Lily Hands. You know her." "I know her father, good man." He nodded. "I appreciate that." He did not leave immediately. He leaned against the fence and looked at the sky, which was putting on a performance of white clouds against deep blue, and Martha found herself leaning against the fence too, not from any deliberate choice, but simply because the morning was pleasant and the cow was fine and there was no pressing urgency in the next few minutes. "How is the roof?" he asked. "Fixed. Oates does good work." "He does." She paused. "How did you know I used Oates?" "Oates told me. He mentions it as a reference." Something in his voice was dry without being unkind. "He is also not what anyone would call discreet." Martha laughed. It came out before she had decided to let it, and she noticed, without making a great deal of it, that it had been easy to do. They talked for perhaps another 20 minutes, there against the fence in the east pasture, about the drought and what it was doing to the groundwater, about the railroad that was supposedly coming within 10 miles of Calico Flats within 2 years, about whether that would be good for ranchers or complicated for ranchers. He had opinions that were considered and not dogmatic, and he listened when she expressed her own, which was not something she took for granted. Thomas had been a good listener too, she thought, and then felt the particular strange guilt that came with thinking a kind thought about a living man and a dead husband in the same moment. Patrick collected his horse and said goodbye with a tip of his old straw hat that was neither elaborate nor perfunctory, and she watched him ride back down the track toward the North Road and then turn back to her work. She thought about him that evening, carefully and honestly, which was the only way she knew how to think about anything. She thought that he was a good man and a fair one, and that the business arrangement they had made was solid. She thought that he was the kind of man one could respect. She thought about the way he had touched the cow's leg, and the way he had listened to her opinions about the railroad, and the way his eyes had crinkled at the corners when he almost smiled. Then she thought about Thomas. She thought about Thomas's hands and Thomas's voice, and the way he had smelled of hay and tobacco and clean sweat at the end of a working day, and how his absence still hit her sometimes at unexpected angles, not the crushing grief of the first months but a subtler ache, like a healed bone that remembers the break when the weather changes. She was 30 years old. She was a widow with a ranch and a daughter and $80 that had come from a man who had made a fair business deal rather than a charitable gesture. And she thought that she did not know yet what she was feeling, but that she was not afraid of finding out. The summer unfolded with the particular quality of Arizona summers in dry years, brutally hot in the afternoons and surprisingly beautiful in the early mornings when the light came sideways and golden across the mesa. Martha worked. She worked with a consistency and a method that had always been her natural mode. Up before Clara, feeding the animals, checking the fencing, managing the kitchen garden that was now producing with a generosity she had not expected from the dry soil. Clara helped where she could, which was in more places every week, because Clara was 12 and growing into herself with a competence that Martha watched with a mixture of pride and the particular sadness of watching your child need you a little less. Patrick Finley came by 3 more times in June, each time with a reason that was plausible and straightforward. Once to look at a piece of fencing that bordered land that was adjacent to a larger parcel he was considering buying, to get her read on it since she knew the ground better. Once to bring her a note from Lily Hands, who had taken the cook's position at the Lazy Cross and wanted to thank Martha for the recommendation. And once, and this was the time she noticed most, simply to ask if she could show him where exactly the north side of her property ran, because he was mapping his own boundaries and hers were the nearest landmark. He had brought 2 horses that last time, and she had ridden out with him across the scrubby red land under the enormous sky, and they had talked about property lines, and then talked about a dozen other things. And she had shown him the cairn of stones that Thomas had built to mark the northeast corner of the Bancroft land, and had felt a sudden, sharp, complicated tenderness at the sight of those stones that Thomas had placed there with his own hands. Patrick had seen it in her face. He had not said anything, and he had not looked away either. He had just let it be there, her feeling and the stones and the wide sky, and that restraint, that simple willingness to let a person have their moment, had meant more than any comfort he could have offered. On the ride back, she told him about Thomas. Not the whole of it, just pieces. The way Thomas had come to Arizona from Illinois with nothing but a determination to grow something on this difficult red land. The way he had built the house one summer. The way he had loved Clara with a wholeness that had made Martha's heart feel full every time she watched them together. Patrick listened without trying to fill the spaces. And then, quietly, he told her about his own losses, a younger brother taken by cholera in Texas, a marriage that had lasted 3 years and ended when his wife, a woman from San Antonio who had tried her honest best to love the ranch life, had ultimately been unable to and had gone back east, and they had parted without bitterness and rarely communicated now. It was not a conversation of declarations or confessions. It was 2 people on horseback in the Arizona afternoon, talking honestly about the things that had shaped them, and it was more intimate than either of them probably intended when they had ridden out to look at a property line. In July, Patrick sent a note with a ranch hand asking if she and Clara would come to the Lazy Cross for the 4th of July, gathering he held each year for his workers and the neighboring ranchers. Martha wrote back a careful yes, and then spent an embarrassing amount of time deciding what to wear before settling on a blue calico dress that she had owned for years and that fit well and did not try too hard, which she thought was about right. The Lazy Cross was larger than she had imagined. The main house was solid and well built, with a wide porch that ran along two sides and a view of the valley below that in the evening light was extraordinary. There were perhaps 30 people there, cowboys and their families, a few neighboring ranchers, the Decker family including young Sam who had helped Martha with her fencing and who greeted her with a wave that had a shade of pride in it. Lily Hands was everywhere with platters of food, managing it all with the calm competence of someone who had been doing this work their whole life, and she gave Martha a smile that was warm and grateful. Patrick greeted Martha and Clara with a simplicity that she appreciated. He showed Clara the horses in the paddock with a patience and humor that had Clara laughing within 10 minutes, and Martha watched from the porch railing with a feeling she was not quite ready to name. It sat in her chest like a warm stone. There were fireworks in the evening, small ones, the kind that the general store sold by the bag, and that the ranch hands set off with the particular joy of men who did not require much for happiness. Clara sat on the fence with the older Decker girl and watched with the open delight of a child who is, for this one evening, simply a child. Patrick came to stand beside Martha on the porch, and they watched the small bright lights burst above the mesa, and he said without looking at her, "Thank you for coming." "Thank you for asking us," she said. There was a pause that was comfortable in the way that pauses between people become comfortable when they have spent enough time together to stop needing to fill them. "Clara is good company," he said. "She is," Martha agreed. "She is her father in most of the ways that matter. And her mother in the rest, I expect." She looked at him. He was watching the fireworks, his profile clean against the darkening sky, and she thought that he was a man who said honest things without dressing them up, and that this was a quality she had not known how much she valued until she was standing beside someone who had it. The summer continued to deepen. They began to see each other in town on Saturdays, which became a pattern rather than a coincidence. She would finish her errands at the general store, and he would be coming out of the feed merchants, and they would walk back down the boardwalk together, and he would sometimes carry her packages if they were heavy, not in a way that suggested she could not manage them, but in the way of someone who is simply present and sees an opportunity to be useful. People noticed. In a town like Calico Flats, people always noticed, and they talked about it with the mixture of approval and nostalgia and speculation that small communities apply to two widows or solitary people who seem to be finding their way toward each other. Mrs. Greer, the pastor's wife, mentioned it to Martha one Sunday after the service with a warmth that was genuine if slightly enthusiastic. Old Tom Decker told Patrick down at the feed merchants that Martha Bancroft was the finest woman in the county, with the directness of a man who has lived long enough to consider subtlety and inefficiency. Martha and Patrick both heard these things and did not comment on them, each for their own reasons. Martha because she was still careful with her feelings, still keeping them at a respectful distance from herself, still not entirely certain what she owed the memory of Thomas and what she was permitted to owe to the living. Patrick because he had come to understand, with the patience that was native to him, that Martha Bancroft was a woman who would arrive at her own conclusions in her own time, and that the most useful thing he could do was be honest and present, and let the rest take care of itself. August brought a storm, the kind that the Arizona Territory occasionally staged as a reminder of what nature could do when it decided to stop being polite. It came in from the southwest in the late afternoon, with a sky the color of a bruise and lightning that walked across the mesa on bright legs, and by the time it hit Calico Flats it had graduated from impressive to alarming. Martha was alone, Clara having gone to spend a few days with the Decker family, whose oldest daughter was her particular friend. She spent the early storm hours moving the cattle into the lower pasture near the windbreak, working in the rising rain with the particular focused calmness that comes with having lived through enough bad weather to know that panic is not useful. The horses were in the barn, and the chickens were locked in their coop, and she was crossing the yard from the barn back to the house when the lightning struck the old oak at the edge of the property, and the resulting crack of wood and thunder was loud enough to stagger her. The oak fell across the fence that ran along the north side of the property, not the house, not the barn, but the fence, which was the thing that kept her cattle from wandering into the wide country beyond her land. She stood in the rain and looked at it, calculating. The cattle were in the lower pasture, the opposite end of the property. They were fine for tonight. Tomorrow she would need to fix the fence before they had any reason to come that way. She went inside and dried off and made herself tea and sat by the window watching the storm finish its business. And she thought with a practicality she had cultivated out of necessity that tomorrow she would need to find someone to help her with that fence, because moving a tree that size was not a one-person task. At first light, before she had fully resolved who to ask, she heard horses on the track, and when she looked out the window she saw Patrick Finley and two of his ranch hands coming up the road with a wagon and tools and a length of new fence rail sticking out of the back. She went to the door. "Heard the oak go," he said from the saddle. "Thought you might need the hands." "How did you hear the oak go? You are 3 miles away." "Sound carries after a storm," he said, which was true and also not entirely the answer to her question, and she suspected he had simply been awake and concerned and had sent a hand to check on things early in the morning, but she did not press it. "Come in for breakfast first," she said. "All of you." She made eggs and biscuits and strong coffee for 4, and the ranch hands, respectful young men named Lewis and Cole, ate with the gratitude of people who had been working since before dawn, and Patrick ate with a quietness that she had come to recognize as his particular variety of contentment. Then they went out and spent 3 hours moving the oak tree and repairing the fence, and Martha worked beside them because it was her fence and her land, and she was not the sort of person to watch other people work on her behalf while she stood by, and Patrick, to his credit, simply handed her tools when she needed them without any comment about whether this was appropriate for a woman. Lewis and Cole went back to the Lazy Cross in the afternoon, their work done. Patrick stayed. Not because he had announced that he was staying, but because there were still a few loose rails on the east section of fence that he had noticed, and he fixed those too. And by the time he was done it was past noon and Martha had made lunch from the kitchen garden, cold beef and bread and preserved tomatoes and hard-boiled eggs. They ate on the porch. The air after the storm was clean and cool in a way that was rare in August, and the land smelled of wet earth and green things, and the mountains in the distance were clear against a sky washed to a pure pale blue. "Patrick," she said, and then stopped, because it was the first time she had used his given name without thinking about it first. He looked at her. He had noticed, and he was letting her take her time. "I want to thank you," she said, "not just for today, for the contract in April and for today, and for all the times in between that you have been a good neighbor." "You do not need to thank me," he said. "I want to, because I think there is a difference between what a person needs to do and what they want to do, and I have spent long enough only doing the things I need to do." She looked at him with the direct honesty that was her own truest mode. "I am glad you were behind me going through that bank door." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "So am I, Martha." And there it was. Her name in his voice, simple and warm, and the wide Arizona afternoon around them, and the fence they had repaired together, and the coffee going cold in the cups. She did not lean toward him, and he did not lean toward her, not on that afternoon. But something had shifted in the way they sat together on that porch, something that had been careful, and at a distance had moved a degree or two closer to the center of things. September arrived with a cooling that the land received like a gift. The kitchen garden had been producing well, and Martha had spent 3 weeks of evenings putting up preserves and pickles and dried beans in the root cellar, with the same thorough satisfaction that her mother had felt, and her mother's mother before her. The deep animal comfort of knowing that the cold months would not find you empty-handed. The cattle were fattening well on the improved pasture now that the drought had broken with August's storm, and there had been 2 more good rains since. Martha had 8 healthy Herefords that she was proud of, and when Patrick rode over in the 2nd week of September to look at them, as they had agreed he would, his assessment was straightforward and genuine. "You do good work," he said, looking at the cattle in the afternoon light. "They do good work," Martha corrected. "I just try not to ruin it." He looked at her with that expression she had come to think of as his almost smile, the one that lived mostly in his eyes. "Same principle on a good ranch." "Is that how you think of it?" "That is how my first foreman explained it to me when I was 17 and thought I knew everything about cattle because I had grown up around them. He said that the land and the animals do 90% of the work if you choose right and get out of the way at the right moments. Your job is the 10%. What is in the 10%? Good judgment," he said, "and being willing to change your mind when the situation asks for it." Martha thought about Gerald Howell, who had been unable to change his mind across 4 separate applications. She thought about the wall she had tried to walk through instead of finding the door. "I have been thinking," she said, and then stopped, because she had not planned to say this today, but it was one of those moments where the thing you have been thinking rises up and makes itself available, and it seems wasteful to push it back down. He waited. "I have been thinking about the spring, whether I can manage an expansion." She went on carefully, looking at the cattle rather than at him. "The water situation has improved, and if the rains keep coming, and there is a good water table deeper on the north section of my property, Thomas always meant to dig a well there. I could run another pasture if I had that water, which would let me run more cattle. Which is, frankly, what this land wants to do. How much would the well cost to sink? I have spoken to Franklin Oates. He does wells too. He says $40 for the digging and materials if the ground is cooperative. Do you have $40? I will in November." He nodded slowly, working through the arithmetic. "You would need more than 40, starting a new pasture with new stock, even modest stock." "I know." She finally looked at him. "I am not asking you for anything, Patrick. I am just thinking out loud. I thought you might have a view on whether the expansion makes sense." "It makes perfect sense," he said. "Your land is good. The north section would carry another 20 head easily if you have the water." "That is what I thought. And in answer to the question you are not asking," he said, and his voice was quiet and even, "I would be glad to help with the spring expansion in whatever way is useful, not as charity, as a neighbor with a practical interest in the neighboring operation being as strong as possible." She looked at him for a long moment. "You have a remarkably consistent ability to make generosity sound like self-interest." "It often is," he said. "The 2 things are not as different as people think." She thought about that, and then she said carefully, "Would you stay for supper? Clara is home. She has been asking when you are coming by again, which she told me not to tell you, so please receive that information graciously." He smiled then, fully, and it changed his face in a way she had not seen before because she had mostly seen the almost smile. The full version was something warmer and less guarded, and it sat in her chest like the warm stone again, a little heavier this time, a little more clearly itself. "I would like that very much," he said. Supper was beans and cornbread and the last of the summer's roasted corn, and Clara sat across from Patrick with the particular combination of 12-year-old seriousness and 12-year-old delight that Martha recognized as her daughter's way of dealing with things she found important. Clara asked Patrick about the horses at the Lazy Cross, and he answered with a specificity and respect for her intelligence that made Martha watch him with a gratitude she felt in her whole body. He left after the dishes were done, as the evening star came out over the mesa, and Clara stood on the porch and waved until the sound of his horse on the track faded. "I like him," Clara said with the directness that was her most powerful inherited trait. "I know," Martha said. "Do you like him?" Martha looked at the evening star. "Yes," she said, "I do." Clara considered this with the seriousness of someone for whom it was important information. Then she said, "Papa would have liked him too, I think." Martha's throat tightened. She put her arm around her daughter's shoulders, and they stood on the porch together in the early dark. And she thought that Thomas had been a man who was honest and fair, and who loved the land and who respected a good neighbor, and that, yes, he probably would have. October moved through the land with its particular golden light, and the weeks became full in a way that Martha had not felt since before Thomas died. There was the work of the ranch always, and there were Sunday services and Saturday mornings in town and evenings when she sat with a lamp and the ledger. But there was also now a quality of looking forward to things that had been absent from her life for long enough that its return was notable. She looked forward to Saturdays, to the chance encounter on the boardwalk that was no longer exactly accidental. She looked forward to the evenings when he stopped by on some reason or another, and stayed for an hour and they talked with the easy variety of two people who had found, somewhat to their mutual surprise, that they had a great deal to say to each other. He told her about Texas, about his childhood on a cattle ranch outside San Antonio, about his father who had been a good man and a hard one, about the wide flat land of the hill country, and how it was different from Arizona, and how he had come to love Arizona anyway, the way you come to love a demanding thing, with a respect and appreciation that softer landscapes do not inspire. She told him about Ohio, where she had grown up, about the farm that had been her father's and the school she had attended through the age of 14 before life required other things of her. She told him about coming west with Thomas, newly married and 22 years old, and how the landscape had frightened, and then fascinated, and then claimed her. She told him about the morning she had realized Thomas was dying. Not the long illness, not the details of the fever's progression, but the morning she had looked into his face and understood, with the terrible clarity that comes to people in those moments, that the person she was looking at was leaving. How she had taken his hand and held it, how he had asked her if she was going to be all right, and how she had told him yes, and how that yes had been both a comfort and a promise, and how she had spent the 2 years since then trying to make it true. Patrick listened to all of it. He did not try to fix it or minimize it or offer the platitudes that people offered because they could not sit comfortably in the presence of grief. He just listened, and when she was done he said very quietly, "You have been all right." "I have been," she said. "It has not always felt like it. It does not have to feel like it to be true." She looked at him across the kitchen table, the lamp between them sending warm light over his face, and she thought that somewhere between the bank door and this kitchen table something had happened that she had not planned and had not pushed and had not discouraged either, and that it was, unmistakably, love. Not the same love she had had with Thomas, who had been her first and her beginning. Something different. Something built on different ground, with different materials, by two people who had both been through enough to know what they were building and why. She did not say any of this out loud on that evening. But she felt it clearly, with the same clarity she had felt the things she needed to tell Thomas in that last week, and she thought that clarity like this was not something to waste. In the second week of October, a man named Stu Calloway rode through Calico Flats looking for work on the ranches. He was a capable-looking man in his mid-30s who had come up from New Mexico, and he hired on with Patrick for the fall roundup work. He was a perfectly fine ranch hand in almost every respect, except that he had a habit, which revealed itself gradually, of making remarks in the saloon about the women in the area that were the particular variety of remark that men make when they have confused disrespect for humor. One evening in the saloon, which Martha only knew about because Sam Decker reported it to her with the earnest outrage of a 16-year-old who has just encountered a species of adult he has not encountered before. Calloway had made a remark about Martha Bancroft and Patrick Finley that was crude and specific, and that Sam had repeated to Martha in burning embarrassment, omitting the worst of it. Martha had thanked Sam for telling her, sent him home, and the next morning had ridden to the Lazy Cross. She had found Patrick in the barn, and she had told him, plainly and without drama, what Calloway had said, as much of it as Sam had reported. Patrick's face had done something she had not seen it do before, a still, controlled anger that was quieter and therefore more serious than loud anger. "I apologize," he said. "It is not yours to apologize for. He is on my payroll. I consider it partially mine." He set down the tack he had been working on. "I will deal with it. I am not asking you to fire him on my account. I am telling you because you have a right to know what one of your hands is saying in public. What you do with it is your business." "I would fire him for saying it about any woman," Patrick said. "It is not a matter of who it is about." Calloway was let go that afternoon, paid what he was owed, and given a direction away from the Lazy Cross. He went without trouble, which Martha thought was probably because Patrick had the height and the quiet certainty to make going without trouble the clearly sensible option. The incident had a small side effect, which was that in dealing with it honestly and without drama, and without needing Patrick to perform outrage on her behalf while also trusting that he would handle his own house fairly, they had navigated something real together and emerged from it closer. It was the kind of small navigation that builds the bones of a thing. November came, and the 8 cattle went to the Lazy Cross in good order, delivered by Martha and young Sam Decker on a bright, cool morning. Patrick received them with a thoroughness that was professional and genuine, and he paid her the agreed sum, and they shook hands over it with the satisfaction of two people who have done exactly what they said they would do. "Congratulations," he said. "On what?" "On a full year of managing this ranch and coming out better at the end of it than at the start." She thought about the first day of the year, the debt and the drought, and the 3 visits to the bank that had produced nothing but a more refined understanding of the word no. She thought about the roof and Clara's boots and the fence falling in August and the well she was going to sink in the spring. She thought about $80 and a contract and a man who had made a fair business deal that had given her enough ground to stand on so she could build her own momentum. "I had good help," she said. "You made good decisions," he said. "That is different." They were standing in the yard of the Lazy Cross in the November morning, and Sam Decker was back with the horses, ready to ride home, and the moment had a quality of everything having been leading here about it, and Martha was done being careful. "Patrick," she said, "Martha, I would like to have supper with you, not as neighbors, not as business parties, as something else." He looked at her with those gray eyes, warm and direct, and said, "I have been hoping you would say that for about 6 months." "I know," she said. "I needed to get there myself." "I know," he said. "That is why I waited." Sam Decker, to his credit, found something extremely interesting to look at on the other side of the yard. They had supper 3 days later, at Martha's table, with Clara present for the first part of the evening, and then Clara going to her room with the excellent timing and diplomacy of a 12-year-old who is genuinely rooting for her mother's happiness. They talked until the lamp burned low and the night was full and still outside, and what they said was not dramatic or elaborate. It was the honest, plain accounting of two people agreeing about what they were to each other. He told her he had been in love with her since probably August, and he said it without apology or performance, just as a fact. She told him she thought it had been the day on the porch after the fence repair, when he had used her name and something inside her had recognized it. He told her she was the most capable person he had encountered in the Arizona territory, and that this was not unrelated to why he loved her. She told him that he listened, and that she had not known how rare that was until she had lived long enough to compare. He asked her if he could court her properly, and she said yes, and he said he was aware of the particular complexities of courting a widow with a child, and that he intended to be patient and honest and to earn it, and she said she believed him. He kissed her that evening at the door when he left, and it was brief and careful, and absolutely everything she had been half afraid and half hoping it would be. Winter moved in over Calico Flats with its cold blue skies and its nighttime frosts, and Patrick courted Martha with a patience and a joy that was completely genuine and entirely lacking in performance. He came on Saturday evenings and they read by the fire, or he helped Clara with the arithmetic she was struggling with, or Martha told him about the spring plans, and he had thoughts about the new pasture that were useful and grounded. He brought Clara a book about horses from the traveling bookseller that came through in December, and the look on Clara's face when she unwrapped it was something Martha stored in the permanent collection of things she intended to remember forever. On Christmas Eve, the three of them sat around the table in the light of candles and ate roast chicken from the flock and bread Martha had made that morning, and there were small gifts and laughter and a quality of rightness that Martha felt in her bones. After Clara had gone to bed, she and Patrick sat by the fire and she thought that the house, which had been full of Thomas's presence and then achingly empty of it, was now full of a different kind of fullness, one that did not erase the first but lived beside it, the way the living always live beside the memory of those they have loved. In January, Patrick asked her to marry him. He did not make a theatrical event of it. They were walking along the south fence on a clear, cold morning, checking the fence line as they had fallen into the habit of doing together on Sunday afternoons, and he stopped and turned to her and said, in the plain, honest voice that was his truest voice, "Martha, I would like very much for you to be my wife, not because it makes practical sense, although it does, because I love you and I want to build a life with you and Clara, and I will spend every day doing my best to be worthy of that." She looked at him in the winter light, his old straw hat replaced for the season with a wool cap that did not have the same romance about it, but that she had come to think of with a great deal of affection. And she thought of the morning in the bank when she had turned to find him behind her, holding the door, and she thought that everything that had happened since that morning had been the best kind of unexpected, the kind you could not have planned but could look back on and see as inevitable. "Yes," she said. "Patrick, yes." He took her hand and held it in the cold morning air, and they stood for a moment looking out over the land that had been hers and would now be theirs. And it was one of the finest moments of Martha Bancroft's life, a life that had held some very fine moments and some very hard ones, and that she now felt, with a certainty she had not always had access to, was absolutely worth living. They told Clara that evening, and Clara sat very still for a moment in the way she did when she was processing something important, and then she said, "I have been waiting for you to do that." And Martha made a note to revisit the question of exactly how transparent she and Patrick had been over the past several months, and then decided it did not matter. They were married in March in the Calico Flats Methodist Church by Pastor Elias Greer, who performed the service with a warmth and a legal precision that was entirely characteristic. The church held everyone who mattered, the Decker family, including Sam, who stood very straight in a clean shirt, Lily Hands, who had come from the Lazy Cross and who cried a little and was not embarrassed about it, the Greer family, and a scattering of neighboring ranchers and townspeople who had followed this particular story with the affectionate interest of a community that is genuinely pleased when things go well for people it respects. Martha wore a dress of deep ivory wool that she had made herself over the winter evenings, and it was not elaborate but it was beautiful, and Patrick Finley, standing at the front of the church and watching her come down the aisle on the arm of Pastor Greer's eldest son who had volunteered for the purpose, wore an expression that was entirely unguarded for once, and entirely full. Clara was her mother's only attendant, holding the small bunch of early desert wildflowers that she and Martha had gathered that morning from the mesa, and she did it with a dignity and a joy that were equally matched. The vows were simple and direct, and both of them said them with complete attention, as people say things when they mean them and know that they mean them. They celebrated at the Lazy Cross afterward, because the Lazy Cross was larger and had the better porch for a gathering, and Lily Hands had been cooking since dawn, and the table was extraordinary. There was music from a fiddle player named Jensen, who could make that instrument do almost anything and chose on this occasion to make it dance. And people danced on the broad porch in the March afternoon, with the mountains clear and blue in the distance, and the sky the astonishing color that the Arizona sky sometimes achieves in the early spring. Patrick danced with Martha, and he was not a graceful dancer, but he was an earnest one, and he held her with a care and a joy that made her feel both very safe and very happy at the same time, which she was beginning to think was the most accurate definition of being loved. They moved between the Bancroft Ranch and the Lazy Cross with the pragmatism of two experienced people who understood that both operations were important and that the distance between them was easily managed on horseback. The plan they had discussed through the winter was to build a new house on the property between the two ranches, a central point that would eventually join the two holdings into one larger operation. It was a practical plan and also a symbolic one, the building of something new that belonged to both of them, not his history and not hers but theirs. In the spring, the well on the north section of the Bancroft land was sunk, and the water came up clean and good at 38 feet, which was better than Franklin Oates had predicted, and exactly as Martha had hoped. The new pasture was fenced and seeded, and by April there were 20 Herefords grazing on it, fat and content in the improved spring grass, and Martha stood at the fence with Patrick on a Saturday morning and looked at them with the deep satisfaction of someone who has worked for a thing and made it real. In July, Martha discovered that she was with child, and she told Patrick on a Tuesday evening on the porch of the Lazy Cross, watching the summer light go amber over the valley, and his face went through approximately 4 different expressions in rapid succession before arriving at a joy so open and undisguised that she laughed at the sight of it. "Are you sure?" he said. "I am quite sure." He took her hands in both of his and looked at her with an expression that was all the things he was when he was not being careful, grateful and tender and full. "Martha," he said. "I know," she said. Clara, when told, received the news with a 12-year-old's mixture of excitement and private processing, and then said that she had always wanted a brother, which she stated as information rather than a preference, and then said she would also be fine with a sister, and then said she was going to go think about it, which she did, in the barn, where she could usually be found when she needed to think. The child came in February of 1884, a boy, large and loud and entirely healthy, and Patrick Finley sat in the chair beside the bed in the room of the new house they had built between the ranches, holding his son for the first time, and the look on his face was something that Martha kept in the permanent collection too, right beside the Christmas book and the ring of wildflowers, and the morning on the fence with the mountains behind them. They named him Thomas James Finley. The Thomas for what had come before, the James for Patrick's father, and the Finley because he was new and forward and theirs. Clara was 13 by then, and she took to her brother with a fierce protectiveness and a humor that indicated she intended to be very good at this, and was not going to let anyone tell her otherwise. She held Thomas James on the second day of his life and sang to him, off-key and completely committed, a song she had learned from Lily Hands, and the baby looked up at her with the unfocused ancient eyes of newborns, and Clara said quietly, "I have got you," and Martha in the bed heard it and thought that she was right. The Lazy Cross and the Bancroft land operated now as a single ranch under the name the Finley Cross, a name they had agreed on together one evening in November with a cup of coffee and a map spread on the kitchen table. It was one of the best-run cattle operations in the county, known for quality Herefords and fair dealing, and a foreman, Patrick himself, who paid his hands decently and expected good work and got it. Martha managed the accounts with the same thorough precision she had always managed her own ledger, and the numbers told a story of growth that was steady and honest and built on good foundations. In the spring of 1885, 3 years after the morning in the bank, Gerald Howell's bank found itself in trouble. The board's practices had caught up with it, a series of bad loans made on poor collateral to men with impressive suits and insufficient substance, and the First Territorial Bank of Calico Flats posted a notice in its window that it was reviewing its operating terms. There were rumors it might close, or be acquired by the larger bank in Tucson that had been expanding through the territory. Martha read the notice on a Saturday morning on the boardwalk, Patrick beside her, and felt a complicated thing that was not quite satisfaction and not quite compassion, something more honest than either, a recognition that bad policies had their own kind of consequences, and that the land and the work and the fair dealing she and Patrick had built did not require the bank's blessing to have value. She said none of this out loud. Patrick, reading the notice beside her, simply said, "Seems like a good morning to go to the Greer's for that coffee we promised." And she tucked her arm through his, and they walked down the boardwalk together in the spring sunshine, and she thought she was glad she had been turned down 4 times, because the 4th time had given her something she had not known she was looking for. Young Sam Decker, now 17 and working full-time on the Finley Cross with a competence and a character that made Martha quietly proud, had been the one to tell them that Lily Hands and the carpenter Oates had been seen walking out together along the creek on Sunday afternoons. When this news reached the Finley household, Martha and Patrick exchanged a look over the kitchen table that contained approximately everything the two of them had lived through in the last 3 years, and then Patrick poured more coffee and Martha said, "I hope he treats her well," and Patrick said, "He does good work," which was his highest form of praise, and that was that. The summer of 1885 was good, better than the drought years, and the Finley Cross ran 110 head of Herefords on the combined pastures, and Martha was 33 years old, and had a husband she loved, and a daughter who was growing into a person of remarkable quality, and a son who was 14 months old, and had discovered walking with the passionate single-mindedness of someone who has found their calling, and a ranch that was the best work of her life. Clara was sent to the new girls' school in Tucson in the fall, at her own request, because she had read every book in the Calico Flats schoolhouse twice and was running out of things to learn there, and she wanted to study properly. And Martha and Patrick sat with her plan for 3 evenings and asked her every hard question they could think of, and she answered all of them, and they let her go. The morning Clara left was hard. Martha held her on the platform of the stage depot, with the intensity of a person fully aware that everything changes and choosing to let it. Clara held back with the same intensity, and then pulled back and looked at her mother with Thomas's eyes and Martha's chin and said, "I will write every week." "You had better," Martha said. Patrick shook Clara's hand, which made Clara laugh, because it was the kind of thing he did when words were not quite enough. And then Clara was on the stage, and the stage was moving, and Martha stood and watched it go with Patrick's arm around her shoulders, solid and warm. "She is going to be remarkable," he said. "She already is," Martha said. They drove home in the wagon in the early fall morning, Thomas James asleep in the back on a folded blanket, the land rolling out around them in its red and golden colors, and the mountains ahead blue and clear, and Martha leaned her head against Patrick's shoulder and felt the particular quality of a life that has been hard and has been good and is still going, with more of it in front of you than behind. In December of 1885, a second child arrived, a girl this time, born in the blue hour before dawn on a cold, clear morning when the stars were still fully present. She came easily and quickly and announced herself with a cry that was both outraged and magnificent. And Patrick, who had been more nervous this time for reasons he could not entirely explain, let out a breath that Martha had not known he was holding. They named her Rose Margaret Finley, Rose for the roses that Thomas had planted in the yard at the Bancroft house, and that still bloomed every May without any encouragement, and Margaret for Patrick's mother, the woman who had run the homestead alone for 6 years and lost it, whose story had made Patrick step forward in a bank waiting room one April morning in 1882 and make a fair business deal. Rose grew into the household with the easy certainty of a child who has never known anything but love, loud where Thomas James was quiet, bold where he was considered, and together they filled the Finley Cross house with a noise and a life that made the walls feel larger rather than smaller. A letter came from Clara that spring, detailed and full and funny in places, describing her classes and her teachers and a particular professor of mathematics who had been visibly startled by her grasp of arithmetic and had then become her greatest advocate. And Martha read it aloud to Patrick in the evening while the children slept, and they laughed at the funny parts, and Patrick said, without surprise, "Of course she did," about the mathematics, and Martha thought that this was family. This reading of letters and the laughing at the right parts, and the complete lack of surprise at the news of someone you love being exactly who you already knew they were. In the spring of 1886, 4 years after the morning in the bank, the new house between the ranches had grown. Patrick had added 2 rooms in the fall, and the porch now ran along 3 sides, and the kitchen was the best room in the house, wide and warm with a good iron stove, and a long table and windows that caught the morning light at an angle that turned everything briefly gold. On a Saturday in May, when the desert was doing its spectacular spring thing with wildflowers, Martha sat on that porch in the early morning, before anyone else was awake, with a cup of coffee and the accounts book and the ledger that told the story of the Finley Cross, 4 years of growth, paid debts, careful management, and a trajectory that was clear and good. She heard the back door open and Patrick came out with his own coffee, his hair still disheveled from sleep, barefoot on the porch boards, and he sat down in the chair beside her and looked at the morning desert with its extravagant colors and its enormous sky. "How do the numbers look?" he said. "Very good," she said. "Better than last year." He nodded, satisfied. From inside the house came the sound of Thomas James's morning voice, talking to himself as he woke, and then the softer sound of Rose, and then the particular kind of silence that means a very small child is getting out of bed and doing something she has not yet been given permission to do. "That is the sound of Rose about to do something inadvisable," Patrick said. "Probably," Martha agreed, and neither of them moved for another moment, because the morning was too good and the coffee was too warm, and sometimes you let the inadvisable thing happen, because you know it will not be serious, and you want to stay where you are just a little longer. She looked at him in the morning light, the man who had held a door and made a fair deal and listened and waited and built something with her out of the difficult and the good. And she thought about the woman who had walked into that bank 4 times with her satchel of careful papers, the woman who had been told no in every language that no could be expressed, the woman who had said yes to $80 and a contract, and to finding the door when the wall would not move. She thought about Thomas, who had built this land with his hands and loved her with his whole heart and left her better than he found her, which was the highest thing one person could do for another. She thought about Clara in Tucson, learning mathematics that surprised her professors. She thought about the well on the north section, and the 110 Herefords, and the good iron stove, and the 3-sided porch, and Rose doing something inadvisable in the next room. She reached over and took Patrick's hand where it rested on the arm of his chair, and he turned his palm up and held hers without looking away from the morning sky, a gesture so natural and unconscious and complete that she understood it was the truest thing she could show anyone about what they had built. From inside the house came a crash, and then Thomas James's voice, solemn and informative, calling out, "Rose fell down, but she is all right." Rose, for her part, confirmed this with a laugh. Patrick looked at Martha. Martha looked at Patrick. And on the wide porch of the Finley Cross Ranch, in the extravagant May morning of the Arizona Territory in the year of 1886, with the desert in bloom and the children awake, and the accounts books showing numbers that told the story of good work rewarded. They laughed together the way people laugh when they are absolutely, irrevocably, and completely at home.